"Get up, preacher, or I'll carve my name into your bones before the sun does." The voice cut through the pre-dawn chill, sharp as a blade dragged across flint, low and gravelly, carrying the weight of a man who'd long since traded mercy for survival. The words hung in the air of the small adobe chapel, where dust motes swirled in the slanted light of a New Mexico sunrise, December 1879. The town of Las Sombras lay quiet beyond the walls, its wooden shacks and crooked fences still asleep under a blanket of frost. But inside, the air crackled with something alive, something deadly. Reverend Amos Hale knelt at the altar, his hands clasped around a worn Bible, his gray hair falling in wisps over a face carved deep with years and regret. He didn't turn. He didn't flinch. His voice, when it came, was steady, soft, like the first note of a hymn before the choir joins. "You've come a long way, Jericho. Sit. The Lord's house don't turn away sinners." The man called Jericho stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the pale fire of dawn. Tall, broad-shouldered, his duster coat hung heavy with trail dust, the hem frayed from months of riding. His face was half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, but the glint of his eye-sharp gray, unyielding, caught the light like a wolf's. In his left hand, a Colt revolver gleamed, its barrel steady, aimed at the preacher's back. In his right, a leather satchel, small and worn, dangled loosely, its contents rattling faintly, like bones in a sack. "I ain't here for salvation," Jericho said, stepping inside. His boots thudded on the warped floorboards, each step a drumbeat in the quiet. "I'm here for answers. And if you lie, Amos, I'll bury you where you kneel." The chapel smelled of old wood, candle wax, and the faint tang of sagebrush carried in on the wind. Outside, a coyote's howl rose, thin and mournful, then faded into the vastness of the desert. Amos rose slowly, his knees creaking, and turned to face the man who'd once called him friend. His eyes, pale blue and weary, met Jericho's without fear. "You're chasing ghosts, son. You've been chasing them since El Paso." Jericho's jaw tightened, the muscles twitching under a scar that ran from his temple to his cheek, a jagged line like a riverbed gone dry. "Ghosts don't bleed," he said, "and they don't steal children." He tossed the satchel onto the altar. It landed with a soft thud, spilling open. A small, carved wooden horse rolled out, its paint chipped, one leg broken. Beside it, a scrap of cloth, stained with dirt and something darker, blood, maybe, or rust. Amos stared at the objects, his breath catching. His fingers brushed the wooden horse, trembling faintly. "Where'd you get this?" "You know where," Jericho said, his voice low, dangerous. "You baptized her, Amos. You gave her a name. Now tell me where she is, or I'll tear this town apart board by board." The preacher's shoulders sagged, not with fear, but with something heavier, guilt, maybe, or the weight of secrets kept too long. He looked past Jericho, out the open door, where the horizon glowed red, like the sky itself was bleeding. "You don't understand what you're stirring up," he said. "Some truths are better left buried." Jericho stepped closer, the revolver still steady in his hand. "Then dig them up, preacher, or I will." Las Sombras wasn't a town that welcomed strangers, tucked against the jagged spine of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It was a place of hard edges and harder hearts, where the wind carried whispers of old grudges and older sins. The main street was a rutted stretch of dirt, lined with a general store, a livery stable, and a saloon called the Black Mare, its sign swinging crookedly in the morning breeze. The townsfolk kept their heads down, their eyes sharp, and their hands close to their guns. Trust was a currency nobody spent. Jericho had ridden into Las Sombras at midnight, his horse lathered and trembling, its hooves kicking up clouds of dust that glittered in the moonlight. He'd tied the animal to a post outside the chapel and waited, watching the stars fade as the town slept. He hadn't come for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He'd been a bounty hunter once, a good one, back when the world made sense. He'd tracked men across deserts and mountains, dragged them back to face justice or a noose. But that was before El Paso, before the fire, before the girl went missing. Now, he was something else, a man driven by a promise he couldn't break, chasing a trail that grew colder with every mile. The girl was Lila, 6 years old, with eyes like her mother's, brown and bright. and a laugh that could make the devil smile. She'd been taken from a homestead just outside El Paso. Her parents left dead in the dirt, their blood soaking into the earth. Jericho had found the bodies, the wooden horse, and the cloth. He'd found tracks leading north, then nothing. For months, he'd followed whispers and rumors, each one leading to a dead and a drifter in Santa Fe mentioned Las Sombras, a town where secrets went to hide. Now, standing in the chapel, Jericho felt the weight of those months pressing against his ribs, a dull ache that never left. Amos was his last lead, the only man who might know where Lila was. The preacher had been in El Paso when it happened, passing through to baptize children in the borderlands. He'd held Lila in his arms, spoken her name to God. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. Amos leaned against the altar, his hands gripping the edge as if it could hold him upright. "Jericho," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you're not the only one looking for her. There's othersmen with no names, no faces. They came through last week, asking questions, tearing through the town like wolves. They didn't find what they wanted, but they left blood behind." Jericho's eyes narrowed. "Who were they?" Amos shook his head. "I don't know, but they weren't lawmen, and they weren't bounty hunters like you. They carried knives, not guns, and their eyes they were empty, like men who'd sold their souls and got nothing in return." Jericho holstered his revolver, not because he trusted Amos, but because he needed both hands to think. He picked up the wooden horse, turning it over in his fingers. "You're hiding something, preacher. I can smell it. Tell me where she is, or I'll bring those wolves back myself." Amos opened his mouth, then closed it, his gaze dropping to the floor. The silence stretched, heavy as the desert heat. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a woman. Lives out past the creek, in a cabin by the old juniper grove. Name's Mara. She takes in strays. Children, mostly. Ones nobody wants. If Lila's anywhere, she's with her." Jericho's heart kicked against his chest, a sudden, sharp hope he didn't trust. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because Mara's not like us," Amos said. "She's different. She don't answer to the law, or to God, or to anyone. And if you go to her, you might not come back." Jericho's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've been to worse places, preacher, and I'm still here." He turned, his boots heavy on the floor, and walked out into the dawn. The satchel stayed on the altar, the wooden horse beside it, a silent promise that he'd be back. The trail to the juniper grove was a faint scar across the desert, winding through red rock and sagebrush, the air sharp with the scent of creosote and dust. Jericho rode slow, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds that hung in the still air. The sun climbed higher, burning away the frost, and the mountains loomed like silent judges, their peaks jagged against the sky. He didn't trust Amos, not fully. The preacher had always been a man of half-truths, preaching salvation while keeping secrets in his pocket. But Jericho had no other leads, and the thought of Lila scared. Maybe hurt kept him moving forward, one step ahead of the ghosts that dogged his heels. The cabin came into view just before noon, a low structure of adobe and weathered wood, tucked against a grove of junipers that twisted like old men in prayer. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and a faint hum drifted on the window woman's voice, soft, singing something wordless, like a lullaby for the dead. Jericho dismounted, tying his horse to a gnarled tree. He checked his revolver, the weight of it familiar, grounding. The hum stopped as he approached the cabin, and the door creaked open before he could knock. Mara stood there, tall and lean, her hair black as crow feathers, streaked with silver that caught the sunlight. Her eyes were green, sharp like the edge of a broken bottle, and her dress faded calico. Patched at the hem hung loose on a frame that spoke of hunger and resilience. She held a broom in one hand, but her grip was too tight, too ready, for it to be just for sweeping. "You're the one they call Jericho," she said, her voice low, steady, with an accent he couldn't place. Something Eastern, maybe, or older, like it came from a time before towns like Las Sombras existed. "I heard you coming a mile off. You ride loud." Jericho tipped his hat, just enough to be polite, not enough to show trust. "I'm looking for a girl. Lila, 6 years old, taken from El Paso. Preacher says you might know something." Mara's eyes flickered, not with fear, but with something deeper recognition, maybe, or caution. She leaned the broom against the wall and stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "I take in children," she said. "Orphans, runaways, the ones the world spits out. But I don't know any Lila." Jericho studied her, the way her hands stayed close to her sides, the way her gaze never wavered. She was lying, or she was hiding something. Either way, she knew more than she was saying. "Then you won't mind if I look around," he said, stepping forward. Mara didn't move, but her presence filled the space between them, a wall of quiet defiance. "You're not the first to come looking," she said. "Men came last week. Rough men. They tore through my garden, broke my fence, scared the children. They didn't find what they wanted, and neither will you." Jericho's hand rested on his revolver, not drawing, just waiting. "I'm not them," he said. "But I'm not leaving without answers." Mara's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling the junipers, a low moan like a warning. Then, from inside the cabin, came a sound, a child's laugh, bright and fleeting, like a spark in the dark. Jericho's heart stopped. He knew that laugh. He'd heard it in El Paso, in the days before the fire, when Lila ran through the fields, chasing dragonflies. He pushed past Mara, ignoring her shout, and threw open the door. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit by a single oil lamp on a rough-hewn table. 3 children sat on a rug by the hearth, a boy, maybe 10, whittling a stick, a girl, younger, braiding a doll's hair, and another, smaller, curled up with a blanket, her face hidden. None of them was Lila. Jericho's breath caught, the hope in his chest turning to ash. He turned to Mara, who stood in the doorway, her eyes unreadable. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice rough, raw. Mara didn't answer. Instead, she stepped inside, her movements slow, deliberate. She knelt beside the smallest child, brushing a hand over her hair. "These children are mine," she said. "Not by blood, but by choice. I protect them. From men like you, and from men worse than you." Jericho's hand tightened on his gun. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said. "But I made a promise. Lila's family is dead. I'm all she's got left." Mara stood, her gaze locked on his. "Promises break," she said, "and so do men. If you want answers, you'll have to earn them." Before Jericho could respond, a shadow moved outside the window, a flicker, quick and silent, like a man slipping through the junipers. His instincts kicked in, sharp and honed from years on the trail. He drew his revolver and spun toward the door, just as a shot rang out, splintering the wood above his head. The air exploded with chaos. Jericho dove to the floor, pulling Mara down with him as another shot tore through the cabin, shattering the oil lamp. Glass sprayed, and the children screamed, scrambling toward the back wall. The smell of gunpowder and burning oil filled the air, thick and choking. Jericho crawled to the window, peering through the broken frame. 3 men stood in the juniper grove, their faces hidden by bandanas, rifles glinting in the midday sun. They moved like hunters, fanning out, closing in. One of them shouted, his voice muffled but clear enough, "Give us the girl, or we burn it down." Mara cursed under her breath, a word Jericho hadn't expected from a woman who looked like she'd walked out of a Bible story. She grabbed a shotgun from under the table, her movements swift, practiced. "Stay down," she hissed to the children, then turned to Jericho. "You brought them here." "I didn't," he snapped, but doubt gnawed at him. Had he been followed? Had Amos betrayed him? There was no time to think. He kicked open the door, firing 2 shots into the grove, not aiming to kill, just to scatter. The men ducked behind trees, their rifles barking in return, bullets chewing into the adobe walls. Mara joined him at the door, her shotgun steady. "You want to help," she said. "Then keep them away from my kids." Jericho nodded, reloading his revolver with a flick of his wrist. He slipped outside, moving low, using the junipers for cover. The men were closing in, their footsteps crunching on the dry earth. He counted 3, maybe 4, their shadows long and lean in the sunlight. They weren't soldiers, not with those ragged coats and mismatched boots. Outlaws, then, or worsemen like the ones Amos had described, with empty eyes and no names. He circled around, flanking them, his breath steady, his heart pounding. The desert was quiet now, the wind holding its breath. He saw one of the men, a tall figure with a red bandana, raise his rifle, aiming at the cabin. Jericho fired, the shot catching the man's shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. The others turned, shouting, their bullets kicking up dust around him. Inside the cabin, Mara fired her shotgun, the blast deafening, scattering one of the attackers into the brush. The children were crying now, their voices high and panicked. Jericho's mind raced. Lila wasn't here, but these men wanted a girl, and they weren't leaving without one. He had to end this fast. He sprinted toward the cabin, diving behind a stack of firewood as bullets whizzed past. Mara was at the window, reloading, her face set in a grim line. "They're not here for you," she shouted. "They want Elena." Jericho's head snapped up. "Who's Elena?" "The girl in the blanket," Mara said, her voice tight. "She's special. They've been hunting her for months." Jericho didn't have time to ask why. He saw movement in the grove, a man creeping toward the back of the cabin, a knife in his hand. He fired, the shot grazing the man's leg, sending him stumbling. But another was already at the door, kicking it open. Mara spun, her shotgun roaring, but the man was fast, ducking inside. Jericho charged after him, tackling him to the floor. They grappled, fists and elbows, the man's knife glinting as it slashed toward Jericho's throat. He caught the man's wrist, twisting hard, and the knife clattered to the ground. A quick punch to the jaw, and the man went limp. Outside, the gunfire stopped. The remaining attackers had fled, their footsteps fading into the desert. Jericho stood, panting, his hands bloody. Mara was already at the children's side, calming them, her shotgun still in one hand. The boy was shaking, the girl clutching her doll, but Elena, smallest, wrapped in the blanket, was silent, her eyes wide, staring at Jericho. He knelt beside her, his voice soft. "You're safe now," he said, but her eyes told him she didn't believe it. They were brown, like Lila's, but older, haunted, like she'd seen too much for her years. Mara pulled him aside, her grip like iron. "You want answers about your girl," she said. "Then you help me protect mine. Those men will be back, and they won't stop until they have Elena." Jericho looked at the children, at the cabin, at the blood on his hands. He'd come for Lila, but now he was caught in something bigger, something he didn't understand. "Who is she?" he asked. "Why do they want her?" Mara's eyes darkened. "She's a witness," she said, "to something they don't want told." The sun was sinking now, painting the desert in shades of crimson and gold. Jericho stood outside the cabin, his horse saddled, his revolver cleaned and loaded. Mara had sent the children to a hidden cellar beneath the floorboards, a place she'd carved out for emergencies like this. Elena hadn't spoken, but her eyes followed Jericho, like she was waiting for him to decide her fate. He didn't trust Mara, not yet. She knew more than she was saying, and her secrets were dangerous. But those menth ones with no names were real, and they weren't done. If they were hunting Elena, they might know something about Lila. It was a thin thread, but it was all he had. "I'll help you," he said finally, his voice rough. "But I need the truth. About Elena, about Lila. No more half answers." Mara nodded, her face unreadable. "Then you stay tonight," she said. "We'll talk when the children are asleep. But know this, Jericho, you're not just fighting for your girl anymore. You're in their war now." He didn't ask whose war. He didn't need to. The desert had its own language, written in blood and dust, and he'd learned to read it long ago. He turned to his horse, checking the saddlebags, his mind already racing ahead to the night, to the men who'd come back, to the girl who might still be out there, waiting for him to keep his promise. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something sharper, gunpowder, maybe, or the promise of blood. In the distance, a coyote howled again, its voice rising like a warning or a prayer, unanswered but rising still. The desert night settled over Las Sombras like a heavy quilt, stitched with stars and silence. The junipers stood sentinel around Mara's cabin, their gnarled branches clawing at the moonlight. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt oil and gunpowder, the shattered lamp still leaking on the floorboards. The children were hidden in the cellar, their breaths muffled beneath the trapdoor, but the echo of their fear lingered, sharp as broken glass. Jericho stood by the window, his revolver cool against his palm, eyes scanning the dark for shadows that moved purposefully. Mara knelt by the hearth, her shotgun propped against the wall, her hands steady as she crushed herbs into a tin cup, the faint scent of wormwood rising like a prayer. "You said they'd come back," Jericho said, his voice low, rough as the desert wind. "How many, and when?" Mara didn't look up. Her fingers worked the pestle, grinding the herbs into dust. 3 left standing, maybe 4. "They'll wait for dark, for the moon to dip. They don't fight fair, Jericho. They don't fight like you." He turned, his gray eyes catching the firelight, sharp and unyielding. "I don't fight fair either. Not anymore." She met his gaze then, her green eyes like a storm held in check. There was no trust there, not yet, but something else, recognition maybe, of two people who'd both lost too much to believe in easy promises. "You're not here for my fight," she said. "You're here for Lila. Don't forget that." Jericho's jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek twitching. "I haven't, but if those men know something about her, I'm not leaving till I carve it out of them." Mara set the pestle down, the clink of metal against wood loud in the quiet. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and crossed to the trapdoor. She lifted it, the hinges creaking, and whispered softly, "It's safe now, little ones. Come up." The children emerged, their faces pale, eyes wide. The boy, Tomas, clutched his whittled stick like a weapon. The girl, Rosa, held her doll tight, its braided hair unraveling. Elena, the smallest, wrapped in her blanket, moved slowly, her brown eyes fixed on Jericho, unblinking, like she could see through him to the ghosts he carried. Mara gathered them close, her voice a low hum, soothing but firm. "You sleep now. I'll keep the dark away." They nodded, obedient but shaken, and curled up on a pallet by the hearth. Elena didn't sleep. She sat, knees drawn up, watching the fire as if it held answers she couldn't reach. Jericho stepped outside, the cold biting at his knuckles. He checked his horse, still tied to the juniper, its breath steaming in the night air. The desert was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that lied, the kind that hid knives in its folds. He scanned the horizon, the mountains black against the sky, their peaks like teeth waiting to bite. Somewhere out there, the men who'd attacked were regrouping, licking their wounds, planning. And somewhere, maybe, was Lila. He thought of her laugh, bright and fleeting, like a bird taking flight. He thought of her mother's body, crumpled in the dirt, her father's blood pooling beneath him. He'd promised them, as they lay dying, that he'd find her. That promise was all that kept him moving, all that kept the ghosts at bay. Mara joined him outside, her shotgun slung over her shoulder, her breath visible in the cold. "You're not sleeping," she said, not a question. "Neither are you," he replied, his eyes still on the dark. She stood beside him, close enough that he could smell the herbs on her hands, the faint tang of earth and survival. "Elena saw something," she said finally, her voice low, like she was afraid the wind might carry it too far. "Back in Arizona. A killing, not just any killing. Men with money, men with power. They thought they buried the truth with the bodies, but she saw. She ran. I found her half dead by the creek, 3 months ago. Been hiding her ever since." Jericho turned to her, his heart kicking against his ribs. "And Lila? Was she with her?" Mara shook her head. "No, but the men who want Elena, they're the same kind who'd take a girl like Lila. They don't leave witnesses, Jericho. They don't leave anything." He felt the weight of her words settle in his chest, heavy as stone. "Who are they?" She looked away, her gaze lost in the junipers. "I don't know their names, but they ride for someone big, someone who buys silence with blood. They've been through Las Sombras before, looking for others. Children, mostly. Ones who know too much." Jericho's hand tightened on his revolver. "Then we find them first." Mara's lips curved, not a smile, but something close, sharp and dangerous. "You're a fool, Jericho, but you're a useful one." They didn't wait for the men to come back. By midnight, Jericho and Mara had a plan row, risky, but better than sitting like rabbits in a trap. Mara knew the desert, knew its secrets, its hiding places. She'd tracked men before, she said, not for bounties, but for survival. Jericho didn't ask why, didn't need to. Her eyes told him green and hard, like jade carved from pain. They left the children in the cellar, Tomas in charge, his whittled stick now sharpened to a point. Mara gave him a knife, small but sharp, and whispered, "You're the man tonight, Tomas. Keep them safe." He nodded, his young face set like stone. And Jericho saw himself in the boy's eyes, a child forced to grow up too fast, carrying a weight no one should. They rode out under a moonless sky, Mara on a gray mare, Jericho on his roan. The desert stretched before them, vast and unyielding, its silence broken only by the crunch of hooves and the distant howl of a coyote. Mara led the way, her horse moving with a grace that spoke of years in the saddle. She pointed to a narrow canyon, its walls rising like the ribs of some ancient beast. "They'll be there," she said. "It's where men like that hide a close enough to strike, far enough to vanish." Jericho nodded, his hand resting on his gun. "How do you know?" "Because I've buried men there," she said, her voice flat, final. He didn't ask her to explain. The desert didn't care for explanations, only results. The canyon was a mile off, its entrance a jagged slit in the rock, barely wide enough for a horse. They dismounted, tying their animals to a scrub oak, and moved on foot, silent as shadows. The air was colder here, the wind carrying the scent of iron and dust. Jericho's boots scraped against the rock, each step deliberate, his senses sharp. Mara moved like a ghost, her footsteps silent, her shotgun held low but ready. They found the camp at the canyon's heart, a small fire flickering against the rock wall, casting long shadows that danced like demons. 3 men sat around it, their faces hidden by hats and bandanas, their rifles propped against a boulder. A 4th man lay on a bedroll, his shoulder bandaged, blood seeping through a souvenir from Jericho's shot earlier that day. Jericho crouched behind a rock, Mara beside him, her breath warm against his ear. "We take them alive," she whispered. "Dead men don't talk." He nodded, but his gut told him it wouldn't be that easy. These weren't drifters or common outlaws. Their gear was to good rifles new, boots polished, horses saddled with tack that cost more than most men earned in a year. Whoever they worked for had money, and money meant power. Jericho signaled to Mara, a quick gesture, and they split up, circling the camp. He moved left, keeping low, his revolver drawn. The firelight flickered, throwing his shadow long and lean across the canyon wall. He froze, waiting, but the men didn't notice, their voices low, arguing over something, the map, maybe, or a name. He was close enough now to hear them. "Girl's worth more than the last one said, his voice rough, like gravel underfoot. "Boss says no mistakes this time. We bring her, or we don't come back." Jericho's blood ran cold. He didn't know if they meant Elena or Lila, but it didn't matter. He wasn't leaving without answers. Mara moved first, stepping into the firelight, her shotgun raised. "Drop your weapons," she said, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Or I drop you." The men froze, hands hovering over their guns. The wounded one scrambled to his feet, cursing, his hand reaching for a knife. Jericho stepped out, his revolver aimed at the man's chest. "Don't," he said, his voice low, deadly. For a moment, it seemed they might comply. Then the tallest man, the one with the red bandana, laughed a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "You're outnumbered, lady," he said, "and you brought a bounty hunter who's worth more dead than alive." Jericho didn't have time to think. The man drew, fast, his rifle swinging up. Jericho fired, the shot deafening in the canyon, catching the man in the chest. He fell, blood spreading across the dirt like ink. The others moved then, chaos erupting, gunfire, shouts, the crack of Mara's shotgun. Jericho dove behind a boulder, bullets sparking off the rock, his ears ringing. Mara was a whirlwind, her shotgun blasting, her movements precise. One man fell, clutching his leg, screaming. Another swung at her with a knife, but she ducked, slamming the butt of her gun into his jaw. He crumpled, silent. Jericho tackled the last man, the wounded one, pinning him to the ground. The man's knife slashed at his arm, drawing blood, but Jericho held firm, his knee on the man's chest. "Where's the girl?" he growled, pressing his revolver to the man's temple. The man spat, his eyes wild. "You'll die before you find her," he said, then laughed, a sound that sent a chill down Jericho's spine. Mara grabbed the man's collar, yanking him up. "Talk," she said, her voice ice, "or I'll let the desert have you." The man's laugh died, his eyes darting between them. She's north, he gasped. Old Mission, near the border. That's all I know. Jericho's heart kicked again, hope and doubt warring in his chest. Lila, he asked. The man shook his head. Don't know no Lila. The girl we want, she's got a mark. A scar, like a crescent moon, on her wrist. Jericho's breath caught. Elena. He glanced at Mara, her face unreadable, but her eyes told him she'd known all along. Before he could ask more, a sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic thud, like hooves, but wrong, uneven. Jericho spun, his gun raised, as a figure emerged from the canyon's mouth. Not a man, not a horse, but something else, a shadow, tall and lean, moving with a grace that wasn't human. Its eyes glinted in the firelight, yellow, unblinking, like a predator's. Mara cursed, raising her shotgun. Get back, she hissed, but Jericho was already moving, dragging the wounded man behind the boulder. The shadow paused, its head tilting, as if listening. Then it lunged, faster than anything Jericho had ever seen, its form blurring in the dark. He fired, the shot echoing, but the shadow was gone, vanished into the canyon's depths. The wounded man laughed again, weaker now, blood bubbling at his lips. You're already dead, he whispered, then went still. Jericho stood, his heart pounding, his gun still raised. Mara was beside him, her shotgun steady, her eyes scanning the dark. What was that? He demanded. She didn't answer, not directly. We need to move, she said. Now. They rode back to the cabin in silence, the desert alive with whisper-swind coyotes, the ghosts of the men they'd left behind. The wounded man was dead, the others gone, fled or worse. Jericho's arm bled, the cut shallow but stinging, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing. Mara's face was set, her eyes distant, like she was seeing something beyond the horizon. Back at the cabin, the children were safe, asleep in the cellar. Mara checked them, her hands gentle but quick, then turned to Jericho. You heard him, she said. The old mission. That's where they're taking Elena. And Lila? Jericho asked, his voice rough. Mara hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. If they're hunting girls like Elena, they might have her too. But Jericho, that thing in the canyon, it's not just men we're fighting. He didn't ask what she meant. He'd seen those eyes, felt the weight of them, like a predator sizing him up. He'd faced men, beasts, storms, but nothing like that. It wasn't human, and it wasn't natural. Elena's scar, he said. What does it mean? Mara sat, her hands folded in her lap, the firelight casting shadows across her face. It's a brand, she said finally. Not a scar. A mark from a place called the Order. A cult, some call it. They take children, mark them, use them. For what, I don't know. But Elena escaped. She won't talk about it, but she dreams screams in her sleep, names I don't know. Jericho's mind raced, piecing it together. The men in the canyon, the shadow, the mission. It was bigger than Lila, bigger than him. But he couldn't stop, not now. We go to the mission, he said. We find them, Lila, Elena, whoever else they've got. Mara nodded, but her eyes were heavy. You'll need help, she said. And not from me. I can't leave the children. Jericho thought of Amos, the preacher's half-truths, his guilt. I know someone, he said. But I don't trust him. Good, Mara said. Trust is a luxury we can't afford. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow. Jericho rode back to Las Sombras, his horse weary, his arm bandaged with a strip of Mara's calico dress. The town was waking, shutters creaking open, smoke rising from chimneys. He tied his horse outside the chapel and stepped inside. The air still thick with the scent of sage and secrets. Amos was there, kneeling again, his Bible open on the altar. The wooden horse and satchel were gone, tucked away somewhere, or burned. Jericho didn't care. He stood over the preacher, his shadow long across the floor. You knew about the Order, Jericho said, his voice low, dangerous. You knew what they were doing. Why didn't you tell me? Amos looked up, his face pale, his eyes tired. I didn't know, not for sure, he said. I heard whispers, stories, children disappearing, marked with brands. I thought it was just talk, Jericho. I didn't want to believe it. You baptized Lila, Jericho said, stepping closer. You baptized Elena too, didn't you? Amos nodded, his hands trembling. I did. Months ago, before Mara took her in. I didn't know what she'd seen, what she'd run from. Jericho grabbed the preacher's collar, pulling him up. "You're coming with me," he said. "To the mission. You're going to help me end this, or I'll end you." Amos didn't fight. He stood, his shoulders sagging, and nodded. "I'll come," he said. "But Jericho, what you're walking into, it's bigger than you know. Bigger than us all." Jericho didn't answer. He didn't need to. The desert had its own justice, and he'd deliver it, one way or another. They rode north that morning, Jericho and Amos, their horses kicking up dust that hung like a shroud. The mission was 2 days' ride, an old Spanish ruin near the border, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower silent. Jericho didn't know what they'd find there, a Lila, Elena's truth, or something worse. But he felt the weight of it, heavy as the revolver at his hip, heavy as the promise he'd made. Amos rode beside him, his Bible tucked in his saddlebag, his face etched with fear and resolve. "I'm not a brave man, Jericho," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "But I've seen too much to stay silent now." Jericho didn't reply. He didn't trust Amos, not yet, but he needed him. Needed his knowledge, his guilt, his prayers. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, its secrets buried deep. Somewhere ahead, Lila was waiting. Somewhere ahead, the shadow was watching. The wind howled, carrying the scent of sage and blood, and in its cry, Jericho heard the echo of a child's laugh, faint but alive, calling him forward. The desert stretched north like a wound that never healed. Its red earth cracked and bleeding under a sky heavy with the threat of snow. Jericho and Amos rode hard, their horses' hooves pounding a rhythm against the frozen ground, a drumbeat that echoed the pulse in Jericho's chest. The old mission lay 2 days ahead, a crumbling relic of faith abandoned to time and dust. But the air already carried its weight, a heaviness that pressed against the ribs, like the moment before a storm breaks. The wind howled low, dragging whispers of sage and sorrow, and in its voice, Jericho heard Lila's laugh, faint but stubborn, pulling him forward. Amos rode beside him, his face pale, his hands clutching the reins as if they could anchor him to the world. The preacher's Bible, tucked in his saddlebag, thumped softly with each step, a reminder of the faith he'd once preached and the guilt he now carried. "Jericho," he said, his voice thin against the wind, "you don't know what's waiting at that mission. I've heard stories, things no man should see." Jericho didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, where the mountains loomed like silent judges, their peaks dusted with the first snow of winter. "I've seen enough," he said, his voice rough, scarred like the land. "Men, monsters, doesn't matter. I'm finding her." Amos fell silent, but his fear hung between them, sharp as the cold. Jericho didn't trust him. Not Fullamos had kept secrets too long. His half-truths piling up like stones in a river, diverting the truth. But he needed the preacher, needed his knowledge of the order, needed the prayers he muttered under his breath when he thought Jericho wasn't listening. The desert didn't care for trust, only survival, and Jericho had learned that lesson long ago. They rode through the day, the sun a pale disk behind the clouds, casting no warmth. The trail was faint, a thread of hoofprints and broken sage winding through canyons and dry riverbeds. Jericho's arm, bandaged from the fight at Mara's cabin, ached with every jolt, the cut burning under the calico strip. His revolver hung heavy at his hip, its weight a comfort, a promise. He thought of Mara, back at the cabin, guarding Elena and the other children, her shotgun ready, her green eyes fierce. He thought of the shadow in the canyon, its yellow eyes glinting, its form blurring into the dark. It wasn't human, wasn't natural, and it was still out there, watching. By dusk, they reached a narrow pass, its walls rising sharp and sheer, like the jaws of some ancient beast. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, carrying the faint scent of smoke and something metallic, blood, maybe, or iron. Jericho reined in his horse, his hand on his gun, his senses straining. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Amos tilted his head, listening. The wind carried a sound, faint but growing, a low hum, rhythmic, like a chant, rising and falling in the distance. "It's them," Amos whispered, his voice trembling. "The order. They're praying." Jericho's jaw tightened. Praying to what? Amos didn't answer, but his eyes, pale and haunted, said enough. They dismounted, tying their horses to a twisted juniper, and moved on foot, silent as shadows. The pass opened into a wide basin, and there, at its heart, stood the mission. Its adobe walls were crumbling, the bell tower leaning like a broken finger pointing at the sky. Lanterns flickered in the windows, casting a sickly yellow glow, and the chant grew louder, a drone that pulsed like a heartbeat, weaving through the wind. Jericho crouched behind a boulder, Amos beside him, his breath ragged. The mission's courtyard was alive with movement figures in dark robes, their faces hidden by hoods, circling a stone altar. Atop it, a fire burned, its flames unnaturally still, as if frozen in time. And there, tied to a wooden post beside the altar, was a child. Jericho's heart stopped. It wasn't Lila, her hair was too dark, her frame too small, but it was a girl, no older than Elena. Her eyes wide with terror, her mouth gagged with a strip of cloth. Around her, the robed figures chanted, their voices rising, falling. A language Jericho didn't know but felt in his bones, cold and wrong. Amos gripped his arm, his fingers trembling. "That's their ritual," he whispered. "They mark the children, bind them to something. I don't know what it is, Jericho, but it's not God." Jericho's hand tightened on his revolver. "Stay here," he said, his voice low, final. "If I don't come back, ride to Mara. Tell her to take the children and run." Amos nodded, his face pale, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Jericho slipped forward, moving low, his boots silent on the sand. The chant grew louder, the air heavier, like the desert itself was holding its breath. He reached the mission's wall, pressing himself against the adobe, its surface cool and rough under his fingers. A side door stood ajar, its hinges rusted, creaking faintly in the wind. He slipped inside, the air thick with the smell of incense and something sharper blood. Fresh and coppery, the mission's interior was a maze of shadowed halls. The walls lined with faded frescoes of saints and angels, their faces worn to blank stares. The chant echoed through the corridors, guiding him deeper, toward a chamber at the mission's heart. He peered around a corner, his revolver raised. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls carved with symbols that twisted like snakes. At the center, the altar stood, the fire still burning, its flames casting long shadows that moved on their own. The girl was there, still tied, her eyes darting, searching for escape. Around her, a dozen robed figures stood, their hoods low, their hands raised, holding knives that glinted in the firelight. And there, at the altar's edge, stood a man not robed, but dressed in black, his coat tailored, his boots polished. His face was sharp, angular, with eyes like polished obsidian, cold and unyielding. He held a book, its pages yellowed, its cover bound in something that looked like leather but wasn't. He spoke, his voice low, commanding, the chant falling silent at his words. "She is the key," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Jericho's skin crawl. "Her blood will open the gate. The shadow will rise, and we will be its masters." Jericho's blood ran cold. He didn't know what the man meant, but he knew evil when he saw it. He stepped into the chamber, his revolver raised, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Let her go," he said, "or I'll send you to whatever hell you're praying to." The man in black turned, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't flinch. The robed figures froze, their knives still raised, their faces hidden. "You're the bounty hunter," the man said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Jericho, isn't it? You've come a long way for nothing." "Where's Lila?" Jericho demanded, his gun steady, his heart pounding. "The girl from El Paso. Where is she?" The man smiled, a thin, cruel curve of his lips. "Lila," he said, tasting the name. "She was promising, but she didn't have the mark. She wasn't chosen." Jericho's vision blurred, rage and grief warring in his chest. "Where is she?" he repeated, his voice raw, breaking. The man's smile widened. "Gone," he said, "like so many others. But this one," he gestured to the girl on the post, "she's different. She carries the brand, like the one you're protecting." Jericho's mind raced. Elena, the crescent moon on her wrist, the shadow in the canyon. It was all connected, a web of blood and secrets, and he was caught in its center. He took a step forward, his gun still raised, but the robed figures moved, closing in. their knives gleaming. Then, a sound, a low, guttural growl, like thunder trapped in the earth. The shadows on the walls twisted, stretched, and the fire flared, its flames turning black. The man in black's eyes widened, not with fear, but with triumph. "It's here," he whispered. The shadow emerged from the darkness, its form tall and lean, its yellow eyes burning. It wasn't human, wasn't animal, but something else, something old, hungry. The robed figures fell to their knees, chanting again, their voices fevered, ecstatic. The girl screamed, her voice muffled by the gag, her eyes wide with terror. Jericho fired, the shot echoing, but the shadow moved faster, blurring past the bullet, its claws slashing at the air. He dove to the side, rolling, his shoulder hitting the stone floor hard. The man in black laughed, his voice rising over the chaos. "You can't kill it," he said. "It's beyond you." Jericho didn't listen. He scrambled to the girl, cutting her ropes with his knife, pulling her free. She clung to him, her body trembling, her eyes locked on the shadow. "Run," he whispered, pushing her toward the door. She stumbled, then sprinted, her footsteps echoing in the hall. The shadow lunged, its claws grazing Jericho's back, tearing through his coat. Pain seared through him, hot and sharp, but he turned, firing again. The bullets useless against the creature's form. The robed figures were on him now, their knives flashing, but he fought back. His fists and boots a blur, blood and sweat mixing with the dust. Then, a shout, Amos, standing in the doorway, his Bible raised like a shield, his voice ringing with a strength Jericho hadn't expected. "In the name of the Lord, begone," he bellowed, his words cutting through the chant, through the shadow's growl. The creature paused, its eyes narrowing, and for a moment, the chamber was still. The man in black snarled, his book falling to the ground, its pages fluttering like dead leaves. "You're a fool, preacher," he said, drawing a pistol from his coat. Jericho didn't give him the chance. He fired, the shot catching the man in the shoulder, spinning him back. The shadow roared, its form flickering, and the robed figures scattered, their chants breaking into cries of fear. Amos ran to Jericho, helping him to his feet, his face pale but resolute. "We need to go," Amos said, his voice shaking but firm. "Now." Jericho nodded, his back burning, his vision swimming. They stumbled out of the chamber, the shadow's growl following them, the mission's walls trembling as if the earth itself was angry. Outside, the girl was waiting, her eyes wide, her breath ragged. Jericho scooped her up, ignoring the pain, and they ran for the horses. The shadow didn't follow, but its presence lingered, a weight in the air, a promise of return. They rode hard, the girl clinging to Jericho, Amos muttering prayers as the mission faded into the dark. The wind howled, carrying the chant's echo, faint but persistent, like a wound that wouldn't close. They reached Mara's cabin at dawn, the sky gray and heavy, the first snowflakes falling like ash. Mara was waiting, her shotgun ready, her eyes scanning the horizon. She saw the girl in Jericho's arms, her face softening, then hardening again as she saw the blood on his coat. "You found trouble," she said, helping him down, her hands steady but gentle. "More than that," Jericho said, his voice rough, his strength fading. He set the girl down, and she ran to Mara, burying her face in her skirt. "This is Sophia," he said. They were doing something to her, something wrong. Mara knelt, brushing Sophia's hair from her face. "You're safe now," she whispered, but her eyes met Jericho's. And he saw the question there. "What did you see?" He told her everything: mission, the order, the man in black, the shadow. Amos stood silent, his Bible clutched to his chest, his face etched with guilt. Mara listened, her expression unreadable, then turned to the cellar, calling for the children. Tomas, Rosa, and Elena emerged, their faces pale but brave. Elena's eyes locked on Sophia, and for a moment, they just stared. Two girls bound by something neither could name. They wanted her for the same reason they want Elena, Mara said, her voice low. The brand, the ritual, they think it calls something bigger. Jericho's hand went to his revolver, the weight grounding him. "And Lila?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Was she there?" Mara hesitated, then shook her head. "Sophia might know something," she said, "but she's scared. Give her time." Jericho wanted to scream, to tear the dessert apart, but he nodded, his jaw tight. He'd come too far to give up now. He looked at Elena, her small hand clutching Mara's, her wrist marked with the crescent moon. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. "Back in Arizona. What made them hunt you?" Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Men in robes," she whispered. "A fire. A girl like me. They took her." She screamed. "I ran." Jericho's heart sank. Was her name Lila? Elena shook her head. "I don't know. She had hair like the sun." Lila's hair was brown, like her mother's. Jericho's hope flickered, but it didn't die. He knelt beside Elena, his voice steady despite the pain in his back. "You're brave," he said. "Braver than most. If you remember anything else, you tell me. I'll keep you safe." Elena nodded, her small hand brushing his, a gesture so small it nearly broke him. The snow fell harder now, blanketing the desert in silence. Mara tended to Jericho's wounds, her hands quick and sure, stitching the claw marks on his back with thread and whiskey. Amos sat by the hearth, his Bible open, reading softly, his voice a low hum that calmed the children. Sophia slept, curled up with Rosa, her breath steady for the first time. Jericho sat outside, the cold numbing his pain, his revolver across his lap. The mission was behind them, but the shadow wasn't gone. He felt it, out there in the dark, waiting. The order wasn't finished, and neither was he. Lila was still out there, somewhere, and he'd find her, no matter what it cost. Mara joined him, her shawl pulled tight against the snow. "You're not done," she said, not a question. "Not till I find her," Jericho said, his eyes on the horizon, where the mountains stood like silent witnesses. Mara nodded, her face soft but resolute. "Then you'll need us," she said. "Me, the children, even Amos. We're in this now, Jericho. You made us a part of it." He looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, the fire that hadn't gone out despite the weight she carried. He thought of Clara and Wakasa, of the family they'd built from loss, and he saw it here. In this cabin, in these children, in Mara's defiance. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I choose to." They sat in silence, the snow falling around them, the wind whispering secrets it wouldn't share. Inside, the children slept, their breaths a soft rhythm, a fragile spark against the gathering dark. Amos's voice drifted out, reading from Psalms, a promise of deliverance in a land that offered none. Jericho stood, his revolver heavy in his hand. "We'll ride at first light," he said. "Find the man in black. And this." Mara nodded, her hand brushing his arm, a touch that said more than words. "And if the shadow comes?" Jericho's lips curled, not a smile, but a challenge. "Then I'll kill it, or it'll kill me." The morning came cold and clear, the snow a thin veil across the desert. Jericho, Mara, and Amos rode north, the children left with a neighbor, an old woman who knew Mara's secrets and kept her own. Sophia and Elena clung to each other, their eyes bright with fear and hope, and Jericho made them a promise, a silent one, sealed with a nod. "I'll come back." The trail led them to a mining town, a cluster of shacks and saloons huddled against a cliff, its air thick with the stench of sulfur and greed. The man in black was there, Mara said, her information gleaned from whispers in Las Sombras, from men who drank too much and talked too loud. He was the key, the leader of the order, the one who knew where Lila was. They found him in a saloon, his black coat pristine despite the dust, his eyes glinting as he played cards with men who didn't know they were already dead. Jericho walked in, his boots loud on the floor, his revolver drawn. The saloon fell silent, glasses clinking to a stop, eyes turning. "You," Jericho said, his voice a blade. "Where's Lila?" The man in black looked up, his smile cold, unyielding. "You're persistent," he said. "I admire that. But you're too late." Jericho fired, not at the man, but at the table, splintering it, scattering cards and coins. The other men scrambled back, shouting, but the man in black didn't move. "She's alive," he said, his voice calm, taunting. "But you'll never find her. Not without me." Jericho grabbed him, slamming him against the wall, his gun pressed to the man's throat. "Talk," he growled. The man laughed, blood trickling from his lip. "The shadow owns her now," he said. "Like it owns us all." Mara stepped forward, her shotgun raised. "Where is she?" she demanded, her voice steady, fierce. The man's eyes flickered to her, then back to Jericho. "The border," he said. "A camp hidden in the caves. But you'll die before you reach her." Jericho didn't hesitate. He knocked the man out, tying him with rope from the saloon's bar. They dragged him outside, ignoring the protests of the patrons, and threw him over Amos's horse. The preacher's face was pale, but he didn't falter, his hands steady on the reins. They rode to the border, the desert blurring past, the snow turning to slush under their horses' hooves. The caves were there, hidden in a maze of rock and shadow, their mouths dark and silent. Jericho felt the shadow before he saw it, its presence a weight in the air, a cold that sank into his bones. They left the man in black tied to a tree, his eyes defiant but scared. Mara led the way, her shotgun ready, her steps sure. Amos followed, his Bible clutched tight, his prayers a whisper. The caves were a labyrinth, their walls slick with moisture, their air heavy with the smell of decay. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, their light dim, casting shadows that moved on their own. They found the camp deep inside, a circle of tents and crates, men in robes chanting softly, their faces hidden. And there, in a cage of iron and wood, was Lila. Jericho's heart stopped. She was alive, her brown eyes wide, her hair matted with dirt. She saw him, her lips trembling, and whispered, "Jericho?" He ran to her, cutting the lock with his knife, pulling her into his arms. She was light, but warm, alive. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "I promised." The robed men turned, their knives drawn, but Mara was faster, her shotgun blasting, scattering them. Amos stood at her side, his Bible raised, his voice loud now, a prayer that shook the cave. The shadow appeared, its yellow eyes burning, its form twisting, but Jericho didn't care. He held Lila, shielding her, his revolver firing at anything that moved. The man in black's laughter echoed from outside, sharp and cruel. "You can't stop it," he shouted. "It's coming." The shadow lunged, its claws slashing, but Jericho was ready. He pushed Lila behind him, firing, his bullets useless but buying time. Mara threw a lantern, its oil igniting, flames spreading across the cave. The shadow roared, retreating, its form flickering in the firelight. They ran, Jericho carrying Lila, Mara, and Amos behind him. The cave trembled, rocks falling, the shadow's growl fading as the flames grew. They burst into the daylight, the man in black gone, the tree empty, his ropes cut. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, but alive with the promise of hope. They rode back to Las Sombras, Lila clinging to Jericho, her breath soft against his chest. Mara and Amos rode beside him, their faces tired but resolute. The shadow was gone, for now, but the order wasn't. They'd come again, Jericho knew, but he'd be ready. At Mara's cabin, the children ran to them, Elena and Sophia hugging Lila, their laughter a sound that cut through the cold. Mara watched, her eyes soft, and Jericho saw the family she'd built, not by blood, but by choice. He thought of Clara and Wakasa, of the saloon in Santa Rosita, of the promises they'd kept. "You did it," Mara said, her voice quiet, proud. Jericho shook his head. "We did it." Amos knelt beside Lila, his Bible open, his voice gentle. "You're safe now," he said, "and you're loved." Lila looked at Jericho, her eyes bright, and whispered, "You kept your promise." He nodded, his throat tight, and for the first time in months, he felt the ghosts lift. Just a little. The desert wind blew soft that night, carrying the scent of sage and snow. Jericho sat outside the cabin, Lila asleep inside, Mara and the children beside her. Amos was there, his Bible closed, his eyes on the stars. "What now?" he asked. Jericho looked at the horizon, where the mountains stood, silent and eternal. "We keep going," he said, "for them." And in the quiet, the desert answered, its voice a whisper of hope, a promise that some things family, courage, love could survive even the darkest shadows.